Hello and welcome. Today we're taking a look at a computer I picked up from an auction. The goal is to turn this computer into a mid-range gaming PC for 1080p gaming. The PC originally came with an i7 4770K, a 4-core 8-thread CPU from the Haswell era, which was water-cooled with a Corsair 120mm AIO cooler. The 4770K is a very competent CPU even to this day, and thanks to the fact that it's hyper-threaded, we should have decent frame rates even with games that are more hard to run, such as Shadow of the Tomb Raider and Anthem. The computer also came with a kit of 4 8GB sticks of Ballistics DDR3 memory, totaling 32 gigs, of which we'll be using 16 for another build and 16GB for this one. Also included was a 480GB Intel SSD and a GTX 750 Ti. We'll be reusing the SSD and keeping the 750 Ti for another more budget-oriented build. I actually ended up overpaying a bit for this PC, since I bought it at an online auction and completely missed the fact that I had to pay a fee based on the price for the object I bought. So in total this build ended up costing us 470 for the PC itself, 110 euros for the MSI RX580 Gaming X 8GB, 15 euros for a used 1TB hard drive, and then we actually have to deduct the price for the components we're using for other builds, which means we have to deduct 40 euros for the 16GB of RAM and 50 euros for the GTX 750 Ti, leaving us with a total build cost of 501 euros. And as the market stands today, I think we'll be able to make a profit on this build as well. Starting everything off, we need to disassemble the build so we can clean the parts and make them look shiny and new. Let's go. Now that we have all the parts cleaned up and they look like they just came out of the box, we can go ahead and put everything together. But before that, let's go over the specs of this build and what we can expect from it. As mentioned before, we're going for a mid-range gaming PC that hopefully will be able to play most newer games on high settings in 1080p at about 60 FPS. The specs are as follows: an i7 4770K, 16GB of ballistics DDR3 1600 MHz memory, a GB C87 motherboard, Intel 480GB SSD, a 1TB spinning hard drive, 850 watts XFX power supply, and an MSI Gaming X RX580 8GB. And as mentioned before, the case is the Corsair 780T. The RX580, despite being released back in April of 2017, is still a good choice for a used GPU in late 2019. And you can get one for around €100. It will deliver really good price to performance compared to the GTX 1060 6GB, which usually go for a bit higher. If you're looking to buy a new GPU, however, I wouldn't go for it and instead look at something like a GTX 1660 or a GTX 1660 Ti, since you get more performance for about the same money you would pay for a new RX 590. With that out of the way, let's put this thing together. With everything put together, I must say it turned out really good, and the case is, much thanks to its size, one of the easier ones to build in, and despite being a few years old, it doesn't look too dated. For good measure, we also added a blue LED strip in the top of the case to really give it that gamer feel. Since the last video, we've added some new games and tests to our benchmarks. I hope this section won't be too long, but we wanted to showcase some more relatively new games together with the standard benchmark games, with more newer games coming in future videos. But I don't want to keep you waiting any longer, so let's take a look how this beast performs in our benchmarks. First up is Cinebench R15, which will give us an indication of the CPU performance. With the system overclocked to 4.2 GHz on all cores, we get a multi-core score of 837. and a single core score of 166, placing it at second place for the multi-core score in our used benchmark list, just below the 4790K clocked at 4.4 GHz. As for single core, we're at 5th place, beaten by the 6600Ks and the 4790K. Moving on to Cinebench R20, we see the same result in the multi-core test, this time with a score of 1981. For the single core test, the result looks the same, with the 6600Ks and 4790K beating our score of 394. For the overall test, we're going with Firestrike and Time Spy, as these tests are familiar to a lot of people. Firestrike is up first, and with a score of 13,157, we're at third place in our comparison charts, below the 1660 Ti rig and the 1070 rig. We're actually beating the 1066GB builds, despite the 3770K not being that much slower than the 4770K. And in this case the 3770K is clocked higher, raising the question if the RX580 now has surpassed the GTX 1060 in performance. That's something for another video though. Meanwhile, in Time Spy, we see a similar result with a score of 4756. Even in this test, we're beating the 1060 6GB result. Well worth taking a look at later. Moving on to superposition, we see a score of 6479, and here we haven't collected enough data yet to show you a chart that will be meaningful, but we'll include this in the future. For the gaming benchmarks, this time we decided to exclude the 0.1% lows, as in many games these are misleading in terms of stutter or bad performance, since it's easily impacted by a single load stutter at the start of a game, or for example when loading a new area. Instead, we'll tell you if the game runs bad or if stutters occur. With that out of the way, we're moving on to some real-world games. Fortnite is first up. A really popular game that a lot of people play these days, and a favorite with the younger gamers. With all the settings at Epic, we see an average of 90.6 FPS with a 1% low of 63.2 FPS. Dropping the settings down to medium but keeping the view distance at Epic is giving us an average of 164.1 FPS with a 1% low of 98.2, making this the choice if you're running a high refresh rate monitor such as a 144Hz panel. For the comparison charts, we see this computer sitting at 5th place, running Epic settings, which is similar to the result at medium settings, where we are at 4th place with the Nvidia cards in the lead with about 20 FPS. Next game up is Counter-Strike, also a really popular esports title to this day. Here we see an average of 257.8 FPS and a 1% low of 28.8 FPS at 1080p high settings. The game ran smoothly and with no noticeable stutters or slowdowns. We recently changed this test around to use the community FPS benchmark map, and that's why the 1% loads are a bit low. We'll go back to testing the normal gameplay, since this testing method, although consistent, doesn't seem to get results that really are related to real gameplay. However, this rig placed itself in 3rd place just below the 6600Ks. Since this game is not really GPU bound with the RX580, the gains for the 6600Ks are the increased IPC of the Skylake architecture and the faster clock speeds of the CPUs. Next game up is Shadow the Tomb Raider, where we compare the in-game benchmark. This is still a very demanding game even with today's hardware, and at high settings we managed just to clear the magic 60 FPS mark with an average of 61.1 FPS and a 1% low of 41. These results aren't great, but for an adventure game like this, it's very playable without stutters or slowdowns. If we drop the settings down to low, we see an increase of FPS to 72.5 with a 1% low of 48. Personally, I would stick to the slightly low frame rate and have higher settings, considering this game is more about beautiful surroundings and impressive graphics more than fast-paced action. Comparing to the other builds, we see that this rig places itself in 4th place at the high settings, just below the 6600Ks again, and the same for the low settings chart. Anthem is also a very demanding game and was released February of 2019. In this game at high settings we see an average of 57.2 and a 1% low of 39.6. Not quite 60 FPS, and if I was going to play this game on this system I would probably drop the settings down to medium. Not that it was bad in any way, but there was definitely some slowdown in more intense situations. For our next game we have one of my personal favorites. Also a game that a lot of people play since it was released and set to rival the likes of Fortnite and PUBG. I'm talking of course about Apex Legends. The goal of this game is as simple as any other battle royale game out there. Last man standing is the winner. With its fast-paced gameplay, this is another game that promotes high frame rates. And in this game, with everything set to high, we see an average FPS of 99.6, with a 1% low of 58. Definitely a good result, and it's placing this build at 5th place in the comparison chart. If you're really competitive and need higher frame rates than that, you could go with a mixture of high and medium settings with some settings turned off, which gives us a frame rate of 135 FPS with a 1% low sitting at 77.3 FPS. This again might be beneficial if you have a high refresh rate monitor and want to get the most out of it.
That was the whole squad. No quarter given.
Next I'll just be showing you some benchmarks of some other games we've tested with this rig. So here they come. So, after going through the benchmarks for this build, we can come to the conclusion that it works great as a mid-range gaming PC in late 2019. The RX580 still does a really good job when it comes to 1080p gaming. The 4770K, despite being a few years old at this point, is also doing a great job. If you are a person who wants to be able to play games at 1080p and don't want to spend 12 or 1300 euros for a new mid-range gaming computer, this one will do the job just fine. And later down the line you could choose to upgrade the GPU, since I guess even though we're going towards more cores in general, I think the 4770K will do a fine job at least for a few more years, at which point you might want to get a new computer anyway. So I guess the conclusion once again is that you don't have to spend a fortune to get a good gaming experience, especially not at 1080p. If you're not the type of person who just has to play with everything set to ultra, then this computer is going to do the job just fine. I just put it up for sale for 675 euros, and I'll be back with another video soon, reporting on whether or not we made a profit or not. So hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you in another video again soon. Till then, take care, game safe, bye.